What is the best vehicle ever used in combat? Well, my friends, that depends upon your definition of the word best, I guess. Is it based on performance and reliability? Because if so, then I would wager that the most reliable and well-performing vehicle in the history of warfare just might be made by Toyota. Yes, my friends, I am talking about the Toyota Technical. But, of course, since this channel is called The History of Everything, we're not just going to give you the simple answer to that first question. No, we are going to tell you just how a Japanese manufacturer that isn't Mitsubishi got their products used in every war since the late 1970s. Let's go ahead and break this down now. Known to the US government as NTSVs, or Non-Standard Tactical Vehicle, the Technical is a quiet workhorse. It is a reliable companion. Honestly, if vehicles were people, the Technical would be that friend that instantly just wants to fight someone that just insulted their best friend, yet has an iron jaw and somehow never gets knocked down no matter what the odds are. In other words, Technicals are the ultimate literal ride-or-die vehicles. Based on the Toyota Land Cruisers, the then Toyota pickup would be rebranded as the Hilux in the 1990s. These improved battle wagons would be the foremost mobile attack force vehicle in most of the world's wars to this very day. Why is that, you may wonder? Well, in order to understand that, let's take a look at the history to find out. But this time, in order to address that, we're going to go back to ancient Rome. Well, you know what would also be an adventure? If you went to Mongolia with me. Yes, my friends, this next summer I'm leading everyone on a Mongolian adventure and we are going to explore the steppes. If you want to go stay in yurts and have a nomad experience, if you want to go kayaking, hiking, and also camel riding, there are so many things that we're going to be doing here. With temples, holy sites, the Genghis Khan complex, there are so many things that we're going to be doing, and there's only a few early bird spots left that get a $100 discount. So I know that we all love studying history together, but if you actually want to go and have an adventure and learn more of this firsthand with me, then by all means, join me, click the link down in my description, and let's go have an adventure. Yeah, I know. Don't look at me like that. I understand. Please, hear me out on this. It's going to make sense. Because first, we have to talk about tactics. See, during the time of the Second Punic War, Carthage would exploit a major advantage that it had over Rome's forces, that being light cavalry. Hannibal saw a flaw in the Romans' approach to battle and made great use of his Numidian light cavalry, in what can be rightly considered Rome's greatest defeat at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. The Numidian light cavalry were the difference makers keeping the Roman cavalry busy, while the Roman maniples were being lured into chasing the Celts back towards their own lines. The over-aggressive nature of the Romans in response left many of their maniples funneled by the light cavalry into a wedge shape that kept narrowing as the harassment of the light cavalry on their flanks increased. What this would do is create a classic pincer maneuver. The maniples were utterly wiped out, brutally for their hubris. Looking back at it all, you may wonder why. Why did they suffer such a fate? Well, the reason is because Roman cavalry was significantly heavier and less agile. And when I say heavier, I mean heavier for the time. We're not talking about the later heavy cavalry that you typically see in the later Roman period, but that's a whole other video right there. The Numidian light cavalry, on the other hand, was flying around, flanking the Romans ceaselessly, dividing their forces and keeping the horsemen busy. They would harass the cavalry, then part of their force would split off and surround the infantry that the heavy cavalry was supposed to be protecting, and their speed and ability to rapidly redeploy to different parts of the battlefield was a major contributing factor to the Carthaginian victory that day. Keep this in mind for later, this is kind of what I'm referencing here, talking about specifically light cavalry tactics. Moving on from that though, fast forwarding about 2,000 years to the 1880s, and you would have a recent technological development that would begin to change the very nature of war itself: the machine gun. Yes, my friends, the machine gun had just been invented, and never before had there been a faster way to get rounds down range. It was something that would change the fate of war itself. The only problem, really, that they oftentimes ran into was how exactly to get the gun into position itself quickly so that it could send rounds down range. These things were not light pieces, and they were very slow and heavy to try and transport and move around. Thus it was, for the first 4 decades or so after being invented, the machine guns largely became a static defensive weapon. That is, of course, until the Russian Civil War would come along. Immediately in the aftermath of World War I, this would lead to the next evolution of battlefield tactics. And it would come in the form of the Tachanka. Now here is something that I could easily do a whole bunch of shorts on because it is just a hilarious concept, but I want you to imagine, the viewer who is looking at this right now, a carriage that is drawn by 2 to 4 horses. Yes, we're talking like a carriage that you potentially see back in the 17 or 1800s. Except this time, it is a carriage that has a machine gun mounted to it. This, my friends, is the Tachanka. It was something that was developed by the Russians late in World War I to be used on the Eastern Front. But it would really come into its own during the Russian Civil War when Ukrainian anarchist leader Nestor Makhno would pioneer the use of Tachanka en masse. Makhno's forces relied so heavily upon the use of the Tachanka that one Makhnovite referred to himself and his fellow troops as a, quote, republic on Tachanki. Their usage was mainly to counter enemy cavalry and to surprise them with the speed at which the machine guns could be redeployed to another part of the battlefield. Does that, perhaps at this point, sound a little bit familiar? Yeah, it is essentially the same effect as Numidian light cavalry, and you're going to see it's similar to the concepts we're going to be explaining here in a bit. Moving on from that though, the next innovation would occur in Japan in the early 1930s. This being when the Imperial Japanese Army was invading China, and they needed a vehicle with which to get around quickly so that they could, well, go and commit significantly more atrocities, because it's Japan, and their actions prior to World War II and during World War II are spicy, to say the least. I'm not going to even say everything here, but I'm sure that a visual list could probably pop up of just potential Japanese war crimes. Anyway, the Japanese Imperial Army went and asked manufacturers to band together and create a military transport vehicle that could cover difficult terrain. A combined project was begun involving multiple Japanese companies, but the one to take note of here is specifically Toyota. And yes, we are referring to that Toyota.
Tyson power! さらに強く Toyota truck.
Now, even though Toyota is arguably the main character of our story here today, oddly enough, the government had asked Mitsubishi to make them a vehicle, but their vehicle was designed solely as a troop transport, and to be honest, when we described this thing, it was just a little bit too beautiful to end up on the battlefield. This vehicle, called the Mitsubishi PX-33, consisted entirely of 4 prototype vehicles, and was never produced en masse. It was just those 4. Instead of Mitsubishi, Toyota and the others would go and develop the Kurogane Type 95, which retained much of the same styling as the PX-33, but it was far more rugged and meant for off-road driving. Mitsubishi, on the other hand, would go back to their primary role during this time of making Japan's military aircraft, which they were responsible for things like the Zero, just for anyone who is curious. Anyway, back to Toyota and the Kurogane. The Kurogane Type 95 holds a special place in history as the very first 4-wheel drive vehicle that was ever made for use on the battlefield, which is pretty important. Moving forward after that, we reach World War II, which brought along the development of the world's first mass-produced 4-wheel drive car, the Willys Overland Jeep, more commonly referred to as the Willys Jeep. When the Jeep came out, as it would be commonly known, it spelled the end of the usage of the horse in the US Army. Now, technically speaking, of course, they still do use horses in the military, but now it is only really for pulling the wagons of fallen US service members during funerals. The US Army caisson raiders have a long and storied history that we can get into later for a podcast episode or another video, but if that is something that you all would like to see, then make sure to go ahead and like this video and simultaneously comment down in the comment section below if you want to see that. Either way, the Jeep replaced the horse, doing everything from troop transport to messaging to supply trains, and from there it developed an almost mythological reputation for its toughness, durability, and versatility. In fact, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Forces himself, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would even say in his memoirs that the Jeep was one of the 5 pieces of equipment that were essential to winning the war. It was just that valuable. During the Korean War, the Jeep was upgraded, and then later the M151 Jeep was introduced in 1960. This version had an integrated frame, higher ground clearance, and a lower center of gravity. It was given an independent suspension and coil springs as well. Also, I just have to say here as a small little ridiculous side note, there was actually a version of the Jeep that was released in 1955 called the M38A1D that had a small number of vehicles equipped with M28 and M29 Davy Crockett weapon systems. This was and of course I cannot believe that I'm actually even saying this, I've actually covered this a couple times here on shorts, tactical nuclear recoilless smoothbore gun designed to fire the M388 nuclear round. Yes, this was a very compact pure fission device weighing 50.9 pounds or 23.1 kilograms, and when packaged in the M388 round weighed 76 pounds or 34 kilograms. This weapon had an official yield of 20 tons of TNT and contained 26 pounds or 12 kilograms of high explosives. Basically, the entire thing looked like a watermelon on fins, and the round was accurate at relatively short range. But it still had a limited total effective range for a nuclear weapon of just 2.5 miles or roughly 4 kilometers. When I talk about this, the Army would say that the crew should technically survive unscathed were this weapon to be used in combat. But I have to say this right now, that is a very bold claim and not easily believed, considering that it was never actually used in combat. I mean, sure, they would probably survive the blast, but there's really only so many times that you can be within 3 miles of a nuke going off before some type of long-term damage occurs. Remember, my friends, this is the same government that would eventually say that Agent Orange was perfectly safe to use in Vietnam. Spoiler alert, it was not perfectly safe to use in Vietnam or just about anywhere. Besides that, also for the M28 Davy Crockett variant, it used a spotting rifle that fired depleted uranium rounds, which caused a lot of alarm amongst the troops. No one wanted to handle them. In the end, it was the cost, though, that kept this variant from being widely produced and armed as such. Everything from design to maintenance to repairs just cost so much, and in less than 5 years, this one project approached $20 million, which, if adjusted for inflation, is about $200 million in today's money. And we're not even talking about a plane here. As it stands, the M28 and M29 Davy Crockett weapon system remains the smallest tactical nuclear weapon mankind has ever created, and that's pretty much it. But, that being said, back to our main story. How did we get from Jeeps with nukes on them to Toyota pickup trucks? Well, just like I mentioned here at the end of the whole thing with the nuclear Jeeps, it's all about cost. The Toyota pickup trucks, as I'm going to explain, were cheap. But as for their inspiration, you could probably look at the Pink Panther. And no, I know already a bunch of this is going to pop up here. I already know my editor is going to have a field day when I'm doing this. Not that Pink Panther. In fact, it's probably more accurate to say Pink Panthers. You see, my friends, during the Darfur Rebellion in Oman during the 1960s and 1970s, British Special Air Service, or SAS operators, would go and use civilian Land Rovers that they'd adapted to suit the hostile desert environment. These would be painted pink in order to provide camouflage amongst the dunes of sand. Depending on who was driving them, these Land Rover Series 2A models could be found with all kinds of different special upgrades, things such as extra fuel tanks, radios, smoke grenade launchers, anti-tank weapons, spotlights, axle guards, and most commonly, just a straight-up regular old machine gun. You need to understand, these things were so souped up that once fully loaded, they typically weighed more than 6,000 pounds, and that is even without doors, a windshield, a roof, just completely open. As for the color of it, which you're probably wondering considering that you can see things on the varying different images and video here, why the hell were they pink? Well, the SAS tended to conduct most of their attacks and raids at either dawn or dusk, and what they found is that when you had your vehicle painted a muted pink, the trucks became nearly invisible to the enemy at these times of day. Yes, if you were looking at these trucks during the middle of the day or middle of the night, they would be fairly obvious, which seems kind of dumb, but considering when they were actually used, it was a very effective tactic. And these trucks would serve the British well in their desert campaigns from 1968 all the way to 1984 when a new player would go and enter the arena. But my friends, in order to explain the prominence of Toyota in low-budget militaries, we have to go a little bit back again here, as it has its origins in the Korean War. I know we're jumping around here quite a bit in time period, but it's important we establish the context of every single thing that we're talking about. You see, during the war, the US contracted the production of the Willys Jeep to Toyota. In part because Toyota had produced a remarkably similar, which, was reverse engineered, vehicle for Japan during World War II called the AK-10. Toyota had devoted significant factory space and staff to the production of this variety of light off-road vehicle, so they decided to adapt it for the civilian market. The reason they did this is because Toyota saw a civilian version of the light military vehicle as their opportunity to compete with British car manufacturer Land Rover. To drive this point home, the civilian Jeep was named the Land Cruiser, and it was advertised with all these varying different wacky publicity stunts, such as driving it up Mount Fuji. I mean, if you want to talk about anything with Japanese advertisements, this is one of the key points that you could probably bring up. As a result of these campaigns and how cheap it was to make, it quickly became popular with Japanese emergency services, with police car and fire engine variants. These would in turn be produced through the end of the 1950s. Although later versions of the Land Cruiser looked less and less over time like the Willys Overland Jeep that had started out emulating, it did retain a focus on mechanical simplicity and reliability. And on top of that, the Toyota Land Cruiser started life as a military vehicle, so the civilian versions have always had strong potential to be converted back into military vehicles should it prove to be necessary. And that, in turn, brings us to the Hilux. See, the Hilux is a bit more complicated because it actually had no military background to start with at all. It was launched in 1968, but Toyota wasn't really sure what to do with it, and it underwent several major redesigns, some of which dropped the Hilux name to try and give the vehicle a fresh start. But because Toyota already had an outstanding reputation for making trucks with military potential, the Hilux became the obvious option when Land Cruisers were hard to get. This was helped by Toyota themselves, who gradually made the Hilux more like the pickup version of the Land Cruiser. By the late 1970s, the Hilux was really little more than a cheaper, slightly smaller version of the Land Cruiser pickup variant. And that is extremely important. Due to its low price, its reliability, and ease of repair, the vehicle sold well in markets with challenging roads, which, as you can probably imagine, considering development of the world, namely that would be large chunks of Africa and the Middle East. Land Rover also did have this reputation, and in low-budget wars of the 1960s and early 1970s, the Land Rover was very prominent. But all of that changed in the 1970s. See, Land Rover had serious manufacturing issues starting in the late 1970s that would go well into the 1980s. If you know anyone who owned a Land Rover from that period, they could probably confirm to you that these things were not very well made during that time period.
Something's broken on that back corner.
Also, one of the key things to remember is that Land Rover would shift around this time to cater more towards the high-end market, providing vehicles that were suited for keeping tourists safe on safari, but weren't necessarily meant to be used by militias for battlefield situations. This created a market gap, and that is where the Hilux would be able to step in extremely efficiently. With time, the Hilux would gain popularity with low-budget militaries that had previously preferred modified Land Rovers. Instead of the poor construction that plagued Land Rovers during this time period, a 1980s Hilux would just keep going, no matter what actually happened to it, and from there you could arguably say that these vehicles became the AK-47 of trucks. I actually just did a video here on the durability, reliability, and prominence of the AK-47, so you can definitely go ahead and check that out, but these things were truly insane, and if you want to see how insane they were, just check out the 2006 episode of Top Gear that put a 1988 Hilux through the gauntlet of punishing challenges, which in the end, it would largely survive. Which, oh dear God, was this thing insane. To just give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, this included driving the Hilux down a flight of stairs, driving it into a building, parking it in the ocean surf at high tide for hours, and driving it through a wooden structure. Yeah, if you thought I was done there, no, you are wrong. I was simply trying to go and pause so I could catch my breath. Anyways, they also dropped it from the top of a damn crane, crushed it with a wrecking ball, dropped a camper trailer on it, and completely torched the exterior and interior with fire. As if that wasn't enough, they then went and placed this Hilux up on high on top of a 23-story skyscraper and then just imploded the frickin' building. Even after all of this torture, a mechanic was then able to get the vehicle running again with just basic tools, basic repairs, and some WD-40, which is absolutely incredible. If you're curious to see more about this, there's a YouTube channel called Whistling Diesel that also conducted its own test, where they drove it off-road with a couple 1,000 pounds of concrete blocks in the bed, they rolled it over on a turn, they hooked up a gooseneck trailer to it, and then they had it pull a skid steer loader and a full-size quad cab truck behind it. The total weight of all this was estimated to be around 32,000 pounds, or nearly 15,000 kilograms. And oh yeah, when I say that, the Hilux also at this time had a flat tire while doing the hauling. They then drove it up and down ravines in the mountains of Utah and drove it back to civilization, all without the radiator fan working. And it still ran. In fact, in order to get this truck to stop, to just kill it, they had to go and drop it from a cargo helicopter at a height of 10,000 feet. So please, when I say this, trust me that these trucks are reliable and tough. They are ridiculous. Why though, you may wonder? Well, while many other manufacturers of off-road vehicles make trucks that are comparable to the Hilux and Land Cruiser, none have the reputation for reliability that is needed to sell in markets with challenging roads. Sure, Ford and Nissan did go and sell trucks in the Middle East and Africa, yes. The Ford Ranger is also quite popular for conversion into technicals, as well as the Mitsubishi L200. But these are mainly designed for the North American market, and they don't deal as well with sand when compared to the Hilux. In sandy countries, the Hilux is king. The reality is that other vehicles that are ripe for conversion into technicals have to overcome Toyota's reputation. Converting a Toyota into a technical is a tried and tested thing. It is simple, it is well understood, it is easy. converting other vehicles that are perhaps more expensive and rare is a bit of a risk. What this means is that when a military with a low budget needs to find some light vehicles in a hurry, the Hilux is usually what is on hand and is largely preferred by army engineers who lack experience converting other types of vehicles. They know what to do with these things. And look, it's not just that Toyota has historically made reliable trucks with pre-existing military pedigree, it also makes trucks that are very easy to convert into other things. It is absurdly easy to mount substantial military hardware onto the back without actually affecting the truck's performance or reliability. Whether we are talking about 50 caliber machine guns, anti-air systems, anti-tank systems, grenade launchers, you name it, there is some variety of it that can fit onto the back of a Hilux's flatbed. Any number of combinations can be created, and it's really interesting to note how the tactics employed by technicals have developed differently in Africa as opposed to the Middle East. In African countries, there are often great portions of open land, totally uninhabited except by primitive and isolated communities. This terrain is what historically led to the development of traditional African cavalry tactics up until the 20th century. These tactics never really went away, they were instead just reborn with the coming of the four-wheeled horse. And from there, have proven so effective that there really isn't any kind of reason to change them. Still though, it brings up a question. Why is the Hilux so tough? Why is it so reliable? Well, part of that is thanks to the truck's frame. Toyota decided to use a boxed steel frame instead of a C-channel frame. To explain it simply, a C-channel frame is made using a piece of steel that is shaped like a C, having 3 sides. A boxed steel frame uses more steel, but it closes that open C shape, making it into a tube of steel instead of a 3-sided piece of steel. What this does is greatly increase the vehicle's stability and durability. In addition to that, they also have ladder frame construction for the most part, which makes the frame vastly stronger when driving in off-road conditions. A ladder frame is easier to work on to carry out damage repairs, as it is a separate structure from the main body. Many of the ladder frame components are isolated, and from that, it makes repair work easier. You do not need sophisticated equipment to repair a body-on-frame chassis, nor do you need to be a highly skilled mechanical engineer. It just takes some basic knowledge and the right tools, which are also fairly easy to acquire. And as for what that does, the power of these factors were demonstrated to astonishing effect in 1987, this being during the final phase of the Chadian-Libyan War. This also gives us an opportunity to answer one of the other questions that you may have about now. Where and how did these trucks gain such an impeccable reputation for use in warfare? Unfortunately, to give a complete list would take days, but we are going to cover the first major example of the Toyota trucks being used in battle, and that is the Chadian-Libyan War, or more commonly known as the Toyota War. This is easily the most famous story behind its reputation. For context, in 1969, an up-and-coming military leader in Libya decided that he was going to lead a coup. His name? Muammar Gaddafi. After a couple years, this guy's stranglehold on everything Libyan was absolute, and I easily could probably do a video dedicated to him and other African dictators, as it is quite fascinating and, oh dear God, is it wild. Like this guy, when I describe someone as a character, he sounds like something straight out of a movie rather than reality, but that is another story for another time. Either way, at this point, we've now hit the early 1970s, this being when obtaining oil was at its most scarce. Libya had oil, and the US, looking to secure said oil, went and sent Gaddafi thousands of weapons to support his regime. The French taught his pilots how to fly, and everything seemed all chummy and nice, and then what does Gaddafi do? He basically goes and tells the West to get bent and joins up with the Soviets, changing sides in the Cold War. Yes, my friends, you see, Gaddafi felt that he had more in common with the Soviets, who tended to not exactly mind where their resources came from or how it is that they were obtained. You know, little things like humanitarian rights or other things just really aren't a factor that really matter. And for Gaddafi and how it is that he ran and operated his regime, that was less of a concern. In addition to these factors, one of the biggest things is that Gaddafi also wanted nukes, because of course all the major big players in the world had nukes, and he wanted to be one of those. In fact, there was even a plan, and this is a bit of a spoiler if I do a video on Gaddafi later, that he basically wanted to become the leader of all of Africa. Like he wanted to unite Africa into like one big super country. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So, in order to realize this goal, he then looked towards Chad, Libya's neighbor to the south, which had recently discovered that it had uranium deposits, which, conveniently for Gaddafi, these deposits were located in the north of Chad, dangerously close to Libya, in a region known as the Azu Strip. What to do though? Well, by making a backdoor deal with Chadian President Francois Tombalbaye, Gaddafi agreed to pay £40 million to the Chadian president in order to be able to invade his country and take part of it without any real response. Yeah, you heard that right. The president of Chad went and sold out his own people and essentially sold the Al-Zoo Strip directly to Gaddafi. Of course, when I say this, that whole thing wasn't discovered initially. That would have to wait for another decade before it was realized. But people knew that something was up. When Tombalbaye allowed Libyan forces to invade and occupy all of the Al-Zoo Strip without any significant resistance, Chadians everywhere knew that something had happened, and they were not happy. By 1975, they'd had enough of his lies, and in April of 1975, he was removed by a coup d'etat. He was replaced by General Felix Maloum, who himself was replaced 3 years later by his vice president, Hissène Habre. When Hissène Habre became leader of Chad in 1983, Gaddafi supported a small military rebellion by a group calling itself the Transnational Government of National Unity, or GUNT, and occupied northern Chad. This seemed to be good for Gaddafi at first, but eventually things broke down. These gunts grew displeased with Gaddafi and eventually rebelled against him as well in 1986 because they felt that he hadn't simply done enough for them. Gaddafi, of course, felt that they were a bunch of ungrateful gunts. YouTube? Nope, you can't get mad at me. I did not say what you think I said. I just implied it. So yes, these guys went and switched sides and joined Chad in fighting against Libya. France and the United States would in turn send weapons and vehicles to Chad to support them, and most importantly, this included over 400 Toyota trucks. With this newfound support from multiple sides, Habre would use this opportunity to launch a new offensive against Libyan forces that were occupying northern Chad. However, because the rebellion was rather sudden, Chad's military needed to mechanize very quickly. Rather than rely on vehicles from France or the United States that could potentially take weeks to train to use, what they did instead was convert Toyota Land Cruisers and Toyota Hiluxes into Technicals, mounting Western anti-tank weapons onto them. These Toyota Technicals were then sent into battle against the Soviet-built T-62 and T-55 tanks that were favored by Libya at the time. It was pickup trucks versus tanks, and in any situation, you would probably think that that's extremely lopsided. But wait. On January 2nd, 1987, Habre made his move. The result at the Battle of Fada would end up being a complete and total catastrophe for Libya. In order to understand this, let me just set the table for this battle, so to speak. France had its air force instituting a no-fly zone over the entirety of Chad at this point in the war, which thus neutralized Gaddafi's main advantage over the Chadians, who lacked any kind of comparable air power. The French had done this as part of an overall effort to back out of the conflict, which had dragged on much longer than they had expected. So, as a parting gift, they cleared the skies for the Chadians and warned Gaddafi to not play around in the air lest his planes be shot down. Now, remember that part earlier when I explained that France had trained all of Libya's pilots? Yeah, the Libyan Air Force's pilots remembered how competent and professional the French pilots were, and they absolutely refused to fly any mission against them. Not only out of respect for their former teachers, which was definitely a factor, but mostly out of fear that if they went up in the air, they were going to get slaughtered immediately. So Gaddafi had no choice but to fight his war on the ground. Going into the battle, Libya's forces numbered some 8,000 troops and around 300 tanks in 1987. This is not necessarily a very large force, but it is one that is heavily armored. Unfortunately for Libya's army, by 1987, anyone in Chad who had worked for Gaddafi or supported him realized that he was full of crap and came back to join the Chadian army. Without these local fighters to support them, the Libyan garrisons in the Al-Zoo Strip resembled isolated, vulnerable islands in the Chadian desert. In comparison to them, Chadian numbers were around 10,000 troops, and though they did not have many tanks, they did have hundreds of trucks that were loaded up with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Again, as I said, going into the conflict, this is going to sound like something that is completely lopsided. These light vehicles versus straight-up tanks seems like they would be slaughtered, but there is a very key weakness that the Toyota Hiluxes and Land Cruisers were able to exploit. See, the turrets of the Soviet tanks struggled to keep up with the high mobility and small size of the Toyota trucks, so it was almost impossible for Libyan forces to hit any of them. On top of that, even though the tanks were actually armored, that armor was not strong enough to stand up against the Milan anti-tank system that many of the Toyotas were carrying. So not only were the Toyotas too fast to actually be hit, but their weapons were doing incredible amounts of damage. Against the Libyan army, the Chadian commander Hassan Jammu would conduct a series of swift and classic pincer maneuvers, just like the Carthaginians and Numidians that we talked about at the beginning of this video. Utilizing his light trucks that were armed to the teeth, he would go and envelop the Libyan positions and crush them with sudden attacks from all sides. This strategy was also repeated by Jammu in March in the battles of Bir Kora and Wadi Dum, inflicting crushing losses and forcing Gaddafi to evacuate northern Chad. It's kind of funny when I mention this because at this point you'd probably think that, oh, a president might go and reward a general who had just such an impressive victory to his name now. But a few years later, Haber would actually suspect Jammu of plotting a coup against him and have him executed. But that is probably a story for another time, and that's not really part of this. I just had to mention it. Hey, look, I never said that Haber was actually a good guy. He was just the opponent to Gaddafi, who is obviously even worse than he was, and oftentimes that's how things works when it comes to geopolitics. Anyway, my friends, the war would culminate in the September 5th attack on the key Libyan airbase at Matan al-Sara. This was the place where the majority of Libya's planes were located, and Libya's greatest advantage during the time of the war, without a no-fly zone, had been repeated short-range airstrikes from this spot. So, when French President François Mitterrand said on September 3rd that he was removing the no-fly zone, the Chadians knew that they had to act fast and take out the airbase, or else they could literally be attacked at any moment from the skies. From this, Haber would order Jammu and his men to conduct a mad dash to strike the base as soon as humanly possible, and the attack would thus occur less than 36 hours after Mitterrand would go and pull the French Air Force out of the equation. Due to a little intel assistance in the form of US satellite imaging, the Chadians discovered the lay of the land around the base, as well as the locations of minefields set up with entrenched tanks in firing positions watching over them. They knew everything about the traps that were waiting for them, and what they did next would be absolutely insane. My friends, in one of the wildest occurrences in military combat history, the Libyans would end up being awakened by attacks that were happening across their minefields, and over time, they realized that it was an army of highly armed Toyota trucks that were swarming over the horizon. I can only imagine that they presumably had their jaws drop by witnessing that the enemy trucks were quite literally driving over their mines at over 60 miles an hour, and it was doing nothing. You see, the mines were anti-tank mines, designed to take out significantly heavier vehicles, which meant that these little trucks were just light enough to not set them off. Of course, provided that one drove just over 100 kilometers or 60 miles per hour over them, they weren't actually going to be caught by anything that went and exploded. This is incredible, but the funny part about it is that the whole thing proved to be a little bit situational when on a later date, the guy who came up with the idea of just driving over the mines was trying to showcase the idea and show it off to someone and how it worked, and he accidentally set off the mine that was under him, which blew him and his truck up. Now, luckily, he did manage to survive, but I'm sure at that point in time, the truck was done for. It can't stand up against literally everything. It's just kind of crazy that it worked at this time. Either way, back to the battle. So, even though the Libyan defenders had a 2,500 strong garrison, a tank brigade, artillery, and extensive fortifications, Chadian troops would rapidly overcome the Libyan forces and assumed control of the base. The Libyans were absolutely annihilated thoroughly, with 1,713 Libyans killed, 300 taken prisoner, and hundreds fleeing into the desert, while the Chadian losses were minuscule in comparison. In the aftermath, the Chadians would then proceed to destroy any and everything that they could not carry or haul back, which included 70 tanks, 30 APCs, 8 radar stations, a radar scrambling device, numerous SAMs, and 26 aircraft. They also would go and tear up the base's 2 runways. As a result of this battle, Libya's air force was effectively crippled. There was nothing that they would be able to do. And afterwards, then traveling without lights beneath the moon and stars, the Chadian column would withdraw back to Chadian soil on September 6th. The government would declare that the battle, quote, must be written in gold letters in the great books of victories. Arguably, we could say here in the end that on that night, they even became Giga Chads. Please, for the love of God, don't dislike this video because I just said that. Now, if you recall, I said just a moment ago that the losses that they suffered were minuscule in comparison. The thing that you need to understand about just how effective these tactics were that the Chadians were using is so lopsided that it's hard to imagine. Only 3 Toyotas were lost in the Battle of Fada, while Libya lost nearly 100 of its tanks. Columns of technicals could raid deep into enemy territory and then leave before any tank was able to lumber its way to the battlefield. There was simply no way that they would be able to move fast enough to take out the column, go and support infantry, or do anything for more conventional combat. By the end of the war, the Land Cruiser and Hilux's reputation were untouchable. For warfare on a budget in an open desert environment where the enemy lacked air power, why buy a tank when you could buy just a dozen Toyota Technicals that could be built for the same price? This is why, to this very day, among varying different militia and cheaper militaries in the world, they continue to be used. Why do anything else, really? They're cheap, they're reliable, they're tough, and for the same amount that you'd pay for a tank or a plane, you can get dozens of Technicals modified. Literally, the only weakness that Technicals would have is that they are extremely vulnerable to air attacks. But if your enemy isn't in the skies, there's not anything that can be done really against them. They're remarkably effective. When I describe all this, the Battle of Fada was the first time that Technicals would form the backbone of a military, and the stunning result would ensure that it defined regional military doctrine regarding the use of Technicals ever since. These days, one can find these trucks in use everywhere, from Syria to Somalia, where they became globally popular during the Battle of Mogadishu. Even US Special Forces started using Technicals in Iraq and Afghanistan during the War on Terror because, at times, they were better suited to their needs than a Bradley was. It just really depended upon the situation. Finally, because the Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser have this long history of military use and are easy to convert into Technicals, there are companies that will go and manufacture militarized Toyota vehicles for this specific purpose. Of course, Toyota themselves do not sell to armies, they do not do this, and publicly have stated that they are not happy with how the Hilux has become so prevalent in warfare, and especially when used by terrorist organizations. But honestly, Toyota has no control over the secondhand market, so Technicals will likely never stop being made. To sum it up, here in the end, the Toyota Land Cruiser and Toyota Hilux are the platform of choice for Technicals for a variety of reasons. First, they're just damn near indestructible. They retained their reputation for reliability and mechanical simplicity throughout decades of the Cold War and well into the 21st century. Combined with ease of conversion, cheap cost, and popularity in the civilian market, they became the obvious choice for any kind of impromptu light military vehicle in militaries with low budgets operating in challenging environments. Also, side note here, though I guess it's also not a side note because it's important to the whole story as well, they just kind of look badass. When you go and slap a massive weapon on the back of them, it just looks really cool, and this is something that for varying different militias, government, and especially terrorist organizations, it's why they are oftentimes used in propaganda videos. So when you ever see any of these videos, which I'm not sure exactly how many of these things I can show up here now, you'll know what it is that I'm talking about. Like, these things are visible pretty much anywhere, you would see them all over the news. These Toyotas are quite literally everywhere, and they are the definition, perhaps, of going places. Except that those places are literally battlefields. They go everywhere, to every battlefield. And actually, on that note, if you would like a shirt that illustrates that point, may I recommend our brand new merch that just came out, including this fabulous Toyota truck design that we here at the channel love. Links for that are down in the description, and I highly recommend you check it out, considering how painful YouTube can be at times. Also, don't forget to join our Patreon where you can submit your ideas for future merch that we might possibly make if they are good enough and something that appeals to people. I thank you all for watching this, and I hope that you technically have an awesome day. No, I'm kidding. I had to say the pun. I hope you have a good day. Thank you, my friends, for watching. This has been Stuck With You with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you to James for researching and writing this episode, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Goodbye, my friends.